Welcome to another episode of GNSI Author Series. My name is Sina Azodi, and for this episode, we have Miss Barbara Slavin joining us here. Barbara Slavin is a Distinguished Fellow at the Stimson Center in Washington and a Lecturer of International Affairs at the George Washington University's Elliot School of International Affairs. Prior to joining Stimson, she founded and directed the Future of Iran initiative at the Atlantic Council and led a bipartisan task force on Iran. The author of Bitter Friends, Bosom Enemies, Iran, the United States, and The Twisted Path to Confrontation, 2007. She is a regular commentator on U.S. foreign policy and Iran on NPR, PBS, and C-SPAN. A career journalist, Ms. Slavin served as a columnist for Al Monitor, assistant managing editor for World and National Security at Washington Times, senior diplomatic reporter for USA Today, Cairo and Beijing correspondent for The Economist, and as an editor at the New York Times Week in Review. She covered such key foreign policy issues as the U.S.-led war on terrorism, policy toward rogue states, and Iran-Iraq war, and the Arab-Israeli conflict. She has traveled to Iran 9 times. Ms. Slavin has served as a public policy scholar at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, where she wrote Bitter Friends, and as a senior fellow at the U.S. Institute of Peace, where she researched and wrote the report Mullahs, Money, and Militias, How Iran Exerts Its Influence in the Middle East. Barbara, thank you very much.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Let me ask you this. You've been to Iran 9 times. Let me start here. What got you interested in Iran? Why Iran?
Why Iran? Well, I started covering Iran from afar when I was with the New York Times. I joined the New York Times as a young writer in 1976, and in 1978, the Iranian Revolution started. And I used to write summaries of the news for this weekly section. We had a column called The World, and I had a partner on that column. And for some reason, I was always given the Middle East-related topics. And so I began writing about the Iranian Revolution. And every week for 2 years, I was writing about the Iranian Revolution and later the hostage crisis when Iran seized American hostages. So I knew the issues, I knew the players, the names of the characters, the Iranians, the Americans who were involved, long before I ever had a chance to go there. Later, I was based in the Middle East, in Cairo, and I didn't get a chance to go to Iran during that time, but I covered the Iran-Iraq War from Iraq. So again, we had Iran, we had the Iran-Contra scandal, the death of Ayatollah Khomeini, the leader of the revolution. All these things happened while I was still based in the Middle East. So when I finally had a chance to go for the first time in 1996, I felt in some sense as though I already knew a great deal about the place, although I had no idea how much I had to learn.
Sure. And let me ask you a follow-up. What was your first impression on your first trip to Iran?
It was friendlier than I expected it. I think I write in my book that, the reputation of Iran was for women draped in black, for fanatics screaming death to America. And I remember arriving in Iran early in the morning on a flight, I guess it was from Frankfurt, and that the customs people were very nice and welcomed me. And I was worried. I had a headscarf on because, of course, women have to wear headscarves. And I was worried that it was sort of slipping back on my head, and no one said a word. And, it was friendly, and I had a translator, fixer who met me at the airport, and a driver. And they were so nice. The driver, in fact, was my driver on all my 9 trips to Iran, so he became a friend. So the impression, also at the hotel, people were welcoming, and again, it was not what I expected as an American.
And you decide to write the book. which is, by the way, a very fantastic work. I've read it myself, and for our viewers, you should read it too. What made you, decide that you want to write this book?
Well, I decided to write the book in 2006 because the United States had just overthrown two regimes in the Middle East, the Taliban in Afghanistan and then the Saddam Hussein regime in Iraq. And despite the fact that the U.S. was already getting bogged down in Iraq by then, there were people in Washington who were talking about invading Iran and performing regime change in Iran. People like John Bolton. What was the saying that real men go to Tehran, not Baghdad?
Boys go to Baghdad.
Boys go to Baghdad, real men go to Tehran.
Sure.
Iran was also at that time working on a nuclear program. This program had only been really discovered in 2002. Despite that, the U.S. invaded Iraq, which had no nuclear program at the time. We didn't know that. But the drumbeats were beginning. Iran has this nuclear program, and Iran is our enemy. Remember that George W. Bush put Iran on a so-called axis of evil in a speech in 2002. Iran was supporting groups like Hezbollah. It was supporting militias in Iraq that were killing Americans. And so I thought, Americans don't really understand Iran. By that time, I'd already been to the country 6 times. And I thought, there's a story that needs to be told to the American people before we make another horrendous mistake, like we did with Iraq. And I was a diplomatic reporter for USA Today then, so I was also covering U.S. foreign policy toward the Middle East and toward Iran. And I knew the history, going back to the Clinton administration, of attempts to repair the relationship between the U.S. and Iran. And I knew that while Iran bore a large share of the blame for those efforts not succeeding, that the United States had also missed opportunities, particularly after the September 11 terrorist attacks of 2001. And I thought, I am really well placed to tell this story because I know both sides. I have met, not only all the American officials who were involved, but I know the Iranian officials who were involved. I had by that time interviewed Rafsanjani, Khatami, and Ahmadinejad, 3 Iranian presidents, scores of other Iranian officials, diplomats, and many, many, many ordinary Iranians during my trips to the country. So I thought, I'm the one. I have to do this. This is my duty.
You mentioned the axis of evil speech, and a lot of Iranians think that putting Iran on the list, which was George Bush's, personal decision, really killed the momentum. What is your view, and how consequential do you think that decision was in retrospect? Yeah,
I still think that the period after September 11, 2001 was the most propitious for U.S.-Iran relations. The reason being that Iran was also opposed to the Taliban regime in Afghanistan, which had harbored al-Qaeda, which, of course, was responsible for the attack. Iran had almost gone to war with the Taliban in 1998 after the Taliban killed Iranian journalists and diplomats at a consulate in Mazar-e-Sharif. Yes. Iran helped the United States overthrow the Taliban indirectly. One of the things that I found out in the course of my reporting was that not only was Iran supporting the Northern Alliance, which was an Afghan militia that the U.S. was also using to overthrow the Taliban, but the Iranians were actually providing targeting information through the Northern Alliance for the U.S. military to use to attack Taliban and al-Qaeda targets in Afghanistan. The Pakistanis, who were our supposed friends, were actually giving us false targeting information because they were trying to protect their assets in Afghanistan, who were, of course, Sunni fundamentalist militants. So Iran expected to be rewarded, not only for that, but then there was a conference in Bonn, Germany in December 2001, where Iran and the U.S. essentially created the first post-Taliban government led by Hamid Karzai. And it was Javad Zarif, then deputy Iranian foreign minister, who actually convinced some of the Afghan warlords who were balking at approving this choice, got them to agree to Hamid Karzai and the cabinet that was formed. And Zarif was also the one who proposed that this new government agree to be democratic and to oppose terrorism. That was Zarif, an Iranian. It wasn't the Americans who thought to put that in the Constitution or whatever document. It was Zarif, who, of course, had lived much of his life in the United States and knew our system far better than we knew the Iranian system. So Iran did all of this. I had a trip to Iran in December of 2001 where people were coming up to me expressing their sympathy for 9/11. Politicians were saying now is the time to normalize relations between Iran and the U.S. I had never heard that before. And what happens? Was it end of January, beginning of February? Beginning of February, I think. George W. Bush gives his State of the Union address, and he talks about the axis of evil, Saddam Hussein's Iraq, North Korea, and Iran, which had just helped us overthrow the Taliban and put in place a new government. So it was a punch in the nose to Iran and particularly to the Khatami government, which was then still in power, and which had been trying to improve relations with the United States since Khatami was elected and came in 1997.
Yeah. On that note, I think it was Hassan al-Rouhani, the former Hassan al-Rouhani, who then had told President Khatami, that the U.S. just put the last nail in the coffin of the U.S.-Iranian relations. And indeed, a sad episode. You mentioned Zarif and his expertise and knowledge of the American system. How much, and you've been to Iran. If you were to compare the Americans' knowledge of the Iranian political system and the Iranians' knowledge of the American system, how would you compare them?
Well, again, it depends on what Iranian you're talking about. If you're talking about somebody like Javad Zarif, obviously he knows our system very well. If you're talking about somebody like Ibrahim Raisi, he doesn't know our system well. I was actually at a meeting with him about almost a year ago, where a question was asked about the Guardian Council, which in Iran vets candidates for elected office and makes sure that no one who is not loyal to the system can run. And he said, well, you have a Guardian Council, don't you? You have a vetting system in the United States, for your candidates. And we looked at him like he was insane. I mean, if we had any kind of vetting system, would we ever have had Donald Trump as president of the United States? Someone with no prior political experience, never elected to anything before in his life. So it depends on the Iranians. Some Iranians are extremely naive. A lot of Iranians have conspiracy theories about who runs our system. In my book, I quote one of the sons of President Rafsanjani, the late President Rafsanjani, Mehdi Hashemi, where I had several meetings with him before I was allowed to meet his father and interview his father. And Mehdi Hashemi said, well, you have a Guardian Council, people with money. He said, we have a Guardian Council and we know who they are. You have a Guardian Council, but you Americans don't know who they are. They're people with money. It was actually kind of astute. I mean, people with money obviously have a lot of influence over who gets elected in the United States. If you don't have money yourself or people who will contribute to your campaign, it's very difficult to be elected to anything. But needless to say, we do not have a Guardian Council that vets people for their ideology. If we did, we could save ourselves a lot of grief. Sure. And eliminate a lot of crazy people who run for office in the United States and win.
You mentioned conspiracy theories. Iranians are known to have the experts on producing conspiracy theories, including the Brits. It's the work of the British Empire.
Yeah.
Now, let me ask you another one. Again, you sort of answered this, but the main theme of your book. What is your main theme in the book? And as we were coming here, we discussed this. What is your own criticism to your book?
Well, the main theme, I think, is that Americans need to understand their adversaries better before they make policy decisions. And that if you don't understand your adversary, which most Americans don't, let's face it, Iran has been off limits to Americans for most of the last 45 years. If you don't understand your adversary, it's likely that you are going to make bad policy choices. And there's a sub-theme, which is missed opportunities for reconciliation between the United States and Iran. I write in my book that the U.S. and Iran are like an old married couple that has gone through a bitter divorce. That bitter divorce was the Iranian Revolution of 1979, which overthrew the king, the Shah, who had been very close to the United States. So that was the divorce. And I said, we're not necessarily ever going to get back together again, but we can learn to live with each other for the sake of the children. We can learn to have a relationship that is based on understanding, mutual understanding, and that avoids some of the own goals, the terrible mistakes that both sides have made over the course of the last 45 years. So I think I wanted to prevent another war in the Middle East. I wanted to keep the United States from going to war with Iran, which I thought would be a terrible mistake and would not, would set us back even farther and make any hope of reconciliation even more of a pipe dream.
And your criticism to your own book?
My criticism, I wrote the book in 2006, 2007, so there were some things that I couldn't entirely anticipate. I knew that the U.S. invasion of Iraq was going to help Iran, as indeed it has. But I did not focus as much on Iran-Israel. And the U.S. is called the Great Satan in Iranian Islamic ideology, and Israel is the lesser Satan. But I think that the divide between Israel and Iran has proven to be at the root of the problems between the United States and Iran, because we have taken Israel's side, and of course Iran supports numerous organizations, groups that oppose Israel. And if I had had a chance to write an updated version of the book, I would have included a chapter about Iran and Israel and how that has influenced U.S.-Iran relations. I think I also would have had a chapter on the so-called axis of resistance. These are the non-state actors that Iran has supported, most of them against Israel, also against the United States at times. And again, in 2006, you saw the outlines of this, but it wasn't fully developed into a strategy of essentially encircling Israel with non-state actors hostile to it, and in a sense encircling the United States, which was still, of course, very present in Iraq, still has military members in Iraq and Syria even now, but encircling the U.S. as well with non-state actors hostile to the U.S. and also at times to Saudi Arabia and other countries that have been close to the United States. I would have looked at that strategy by Iran a little bit more.
Maybe an updated edition of the Bitter Friends, Bosom Enemies?
I teach a class at GW, as you know, at George Washington University, and I know that next semester I will have a class on the axis of resistance. I already have a class on Iran and Israel. There's a wonderful comment which I'm not sure if it's in the book or I heard it. No, I think I heard it subsequently from Bruce Riedel, who was a CIA officer and then later on the National Security Council for 3 U.S. presidents. And he always compares the U.S.-Iran relationship and Israel to the relationship that then Prince Charles had with Diana, with Princess Diana. He said, You know how Diana once gave an interview where she said that there was always a third party in that marriage, and the third party was Camilla, who is now the Queen of England, who then was Prince Charles's lover. And if you look at the U.S.-Iran relationship, Israel is the Camilla. Has always been the third party in that relationship, and I would have loved to have gotten that insight into this book.
And I hope that Iran doesn't end up like Diana.
No, I hope not. For all of our sakes. Yeah.
I have two more questions. So right now, April 9th, 2024, where does the U.S.-Iranian relationship stand?
It's bad. It's not hopeless. It's bad because obviously we're 45 years after the revolution. We still don't have diplomatic relations. We still are targeting each other and each other's proxies and various elements and groups that are supported by each other. But it's not terrible because as a result of the negotiations which led to the Iran nuclear deal of 2015, even though that deal did not last, the U.S. and Iran began a process of talking to each other directly and indirectly, which continues. So when October 7th, 2023 broke out and Hamas committed the atrocities that it did against Israelis, the U.S. was determined, and Iran, I think, was determined that this not develop into an all-out regional conflagration. And since that time, messages have been passed one way or another between the U.S. and Iran to that effect. And we have not, as we're speaking now, seen a full-scale war. We have seen a terrible war in Gaza that has killed over 33,000 people. We have seen atrocities committed by the Israelis against the Palestinians in revenge, frankly, for what was done to them. We have seen skirmishes across the Israel-Lebanon border. We've seen attacks on Americans in Iraq and Syria. We've seen attacks on shipping in the Red Sea. But these have been contained, largely contained. And so far, we have not seen an all-out war. So we have means of talking to each other. There are also conversations that are going on, so-called Track 2 conversations and Track 1.5 conversations between academics like myself and Iranian academics, European officials, former officials. And this helps to communicate ideas about ways to de-escalate conflict, prevent conflict from expanding.
So, last question. The 1953 coup in Iran is known to be America's original sin in Iran, and the hostage-taking is Iran's original sin. Things are where we are now. How do we get out of this wrestling with the ghosts of our history? How do we move forward? What's the way forward?
Yeah. Well, I think we had sort of started on that back in the late 1990s, believe it or not, apologizing for what we had done. When Mohammad Khatami was elected president of Iran, he gave a very famous interview to Christiane Amanpour, where he talked about a dialogue of civilizations, and he expressed regret that Americans their feelings had been hurt by the hostage crisis. It was sort of the closest Iran has ever come to apologizing for taking Americans, diplomats, hostage. And then Madeleine Albright gave a speech in 2000 where she expressed regret for the CIA coup and also said that the U.S. Decision to support Iraq during the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s, which killed or injured 250,000 Iranians. She said that had been short-sighted. So you apologize. We should apologize for the axis of evil crack. Iran should apologize for 45 years of chanting death to America. I mean, what kind of civilized country calls for death to the regime of another country? And Iranians would always say, oh, nothing personal, but come on, it's your government, it's not your people. Obviously, Americans do not interpret, Marg bar Amrika, death to America, in that way. So we should start by apologizing. And then we should say, look, we have to treat each other with respect. We have to agree to disagree where we have to. And where we can cooperate and work together, we should do that. I mean, the U.S. has shown an ability in the past to work with the Soviet Union in areas of mutual interest, with China, with communist China in areas of mutual interest. What are those areas? Non-proliferation. It's not in Iran's interest to see Saudi Arabia have nuclear weapons. So one way to prevent that is for Iran not to develop nuclear weapons. Climate. Climate change is threatening our planet. It's a true existential threat. Iran could use our expertise. We could use Iran's experience in dealing with desertification. Public health. COVID. We could have done so much more to help Iran during COVID. Iran was terribly hurt by COVID. And the U.S. could have provided vaccines for free. We didn't. China did. Talk about soft power. Other kinds of academic exchanges. We should work together to prevent piracy in the Persian Gulf, in the Gulf of Aden, in the Red Sea. Hotline between our Navy and Iran's Navy to prevent incidents at sea. There are so many things we could do. Research of all sorts. Iran still has some excellent technical universities that do great STEM research. A lot of it we could work on together. It doesn't all have to have military uses and purposes. But we have to stabilize the relationship first. Stop digging the hole. Iran is going to have to come to terms with Israel as a state in the Middle East. Already, all of the Arab states have basically accepted Israel. Iran has not. Why is it Iran, a Persian, non-Arab country, why is it Iran's role to support all these groups that deny Israel's right to exist? Why does Iran deny Israel's right to exist? All it's done is brought misery and suffering. I don't excuse what Israel has done in Gaza, but Israel would not have done that if not for Hamas, which Iran supports. So Iran needs to rethink these policies, which in the end only come back to hurt Iran. Isolates Iran, gives it fewer options in terms of its not only its foreign policy, but its economy, hurts its own people. So we need to rethink. Iran needs to rethink.
Thank you, Barbara.
You're welcome.
This was a fantastic conversation. Thank you for watching. And thank you, Barbara, again, for your time and the fantastic work on U.S.-Iranian relations. Bitter friends and bosom enemies. Please tune in to the next episode of the GNSI Author Series.